Welcome, everybody, to this Tuesday edition of Inside India. I'm Sri Jegarajah. Here are your headlines. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying it's up to China to de-escalate the trade war as he touts India as one of the first countries the US is likely to strike a trade deal with. And India and the UK are racing to the finish line for a bilateral trade pact amid the fallout from Trump's tariff war. And there may be some relief in sight for the automakers as Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says they are looking to reduce the impact of tariffs for the sector. Right, so as you may have deduced from the headlines, the setup does look reasonably constructive for the Indian markets, but join us in about 45 minutes' time. We've also got the vagaries of the earnings season, of course, to get through. Let's give you Gift Nifty futures. In terms of the indication for the market opening, looking at an opening number in the region of 24,500, so that would represent an incline of about 200 points or so. Let's also give you the dollar rupee rate at 85.086. Asian markets broadly. So as we said in the headlines, the US may soften auto tariffs, but this is really going to be a week perhaps in which the rubber hits the road in terms of tariffs being reflected in the earnings and in the hard data. We have April jobs, the payrolls at the end of this week stateside, HSBC reporting, and also mega cap tech reporting later on in the week. So watch out for potential guidance risk. In terms of the narrative out here, it is looking reasonably constructive. We are seeing some pockets of weakness in New Zealand and in Shanghai Composite. Nothing disastrous, though. The reason you're not seeing any quotes for the Nikkei in topics is that the Japanese markets are closed today, so we're about thin of the ground in terms of traded volumes. On the trade and tariff front, the US is easing back on auto tariffs. US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick saying that the US is working with domestic automakers to lessen the tariff impact and rewarding companies that move production into the United States. And no signs of relief in the standoff with China. But US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says there is a way out if China steps up to talk. He also said China's exemptions show that the country wants to de-escalate on trade.
I think this makes my point that the Chinese, they are exempting all these goods, tells me that they want a de-escalation. And what we haven't done is escalate by embargoing those goods or putting a trade ban on those goods, which we could, if we needed to gain more leverage. We haven't done it. They've actually given us a list of what comes from the U.S. that is valuable to them. And, you know, I can tell you, I do have an escalation ladder in my back pocket, and we're very anxious not to have to use it.
In the meantime, Secretary Bessent indicating a trade deal with India could happen soon.
I would guess that India would be one of the first trade deals we would sign, so watch this space.
In the meantime, veteran emerging market investor Mark Mobius was on CNBC's Closing Bell overnight, and he weighed in on the implications for India from the tit-for-tat tariff war between the United States and China.
And I believe India is going to be benefiting from what's happening with China and the U.S. A lot of manufacturing requiring high labor input would go to India, obviously, because India's got over 1.2 billion people. So that's one point. The other point is that India is gradually coming to an agreement with the U.S. on tariffs. I believe they will reach some agreement. And when that happens, that, of course, will be very positive for India.
So, as we've been saying, there is a clear constructive narrative building, one of resilience and one of India being in the front of the queue in terms of trade deals. And let's round off that picture. As tariffs from the US loom large, India is also closing in on a bilateral trade agreement with the United Kingdom. India's Trade Minister Piyush Goyal started talks with his British counterpart Jonathan Reynolds yesterday in London. Two sides are meeting to conclude more than 3 years of negotiations on the agreement. And over in the country's startup space, beauty and home care services app Urban Company has filed draft papers for an IPO worth $223 million. Some of its backers include Tiger Global, Accel and VY Capital, who will be offloading stakes. The mobile app-based company is present in India, Singapore, UAE and Saudi Arabia, but gets most of its revenue from its home market. Reports say Urban Company has also trimmed its IPO size by over 50% from its initial plan. Similar story we saw with e-scooter maker Ather Energy, whose day one subscription was rather muted with no qualified institutional buyers. And weeks after criticising innovation in Indian startups, Trade Minister Piyush Goyal met founders of new companies. The discussions included increasing deep tech innovations in startups and bringing back skilled talent in India. The Indian government is aiming to create 1 million entrepreneurs in the country in the next 3 years. Let's talk more about this and where we are in terms of building out this ecosystem. Let's bring in Shweta Rajpal Kohli, CEO and President at Startup Policy Forum. Shweta, welcome to Inside India. So we all know that Commerce Minister Goyal has questioned the lack of innovation among startups. So can you share with us your message to government in terms of what kind of policy framework is needed to enable the formation of startups that can take the economy to advanced manufacturing and create quality tech jobs?
Thank you, Sri. It's great to be here on Inside India. I think first let's acknowledge progress and the kind of support that the Indian startup ecosystem has received from this government. And I think we're incredibly grateful for the fact that the current government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi himself, had started an entire Startup India campaign nearly a decade ago. And that has fueled a lot of excitement and energy in the Indian startup ecosystem. And, the proof is in the pudding. And we're all seeing that today, India's startup ecosystem is not only the third largest in the world, but extremely vibrant, extremely stable, and we're raring to go. I think you talked about the recent meeting we had just last week with Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, and I think I can tell you from the energy in the room and the kind of collaborative spirit with which both the startup ecosystem, Startup Inc., as we would like to call it, as well as the government is approaching this is remarkable, because I think this is what we need now. The Indian startup ecosystem has reached an inflection point. You're seeing a lot many more, IPOs happen, as you're saying, which is perhaps an indication of the maturity. And now we just need a few policy levers to take it to the next level.
But the minister does have a point, does he not? Too many startups remain too heavily focused on food delivery platforms and quick commerce rather than driving innovation in deep tech. That's the critical next stage, is it not, Shweta? So what can be done to accelerate that momentum and to really change that picture meaningfully?
Well, Sri, I would say that we have to take those comments in the right spirit to say that, our minister is encouraging that we need to now move towards sectors that will be critical to India. And I think everybody has taken it in the right spirit. If we were to see this as a fact that, yes, deep tech is a sector that is evolving rapidly. Now, look at within the deep tech ecosystem, there are so many subsectors that we're talking about. And yes, that innovation ecosystem is picking up in India, but it needs support all across from investors, from the government and from our founders. And we're seeing a lot of that energy come up. For instance, in the room, last week when we were meeting with the Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, we had space tech company Digantara with us. We had a drone tech company Airbound with us. So we're seeing that this ecosystem is real. It is developing. But as with sectors like deep tech, this takes time. It's a long game. You cannot expect it to get the kind of traction or growth that you see with some other sectors. So I think, at least at the Startup Policy Forum, we believe that every sector has its strengths and will build out in different ways. And we're here to support that entire ecosystem, and also very grateful for the kind of support we're receiving from government stakeholders.
Shweta, China's startups are making big strides in semiconductors, robotics, EVs, battery technologies. And again, the minister has made this point. Indian startups are too preoccupied, perhaps, with building services around, his words, fancy ice cream flavors. Are Chinese startups leaving India in the dust?
Well, I think it's an unfair comment to say that. Our startup ecosystem is very healthy and maturing and doing extremely well. And I think what's important is to move away from words and criticism and talk about what next. I think the kind of healthy ecosystem that is building out in India, as far as the startup ecosystem is concerned, is something that all of us are very proud of, including the government, as well as including, the founders and the investors. And I think we need to move forward and talk about what next. And there we have a super exciting lineup of, policy levers that we're going to see, the kind of growth that we're going to see in the ecosystem. So I would say definitely great momentum across all sectors. And we're seeing a very constructive and collaborative spirit across the government as well as with the overall founder ecosystem.
There is a lot of work to be done, though, Shweta, especially when it comes to the reverse flipping process, which we will get onto later. But if the stated aim of the SPF, now in partnership with the Indian government through the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, is to supercharge India's startup ecosystem and develop quality, perhaps, over quantity, then can you give me a sense of how that's going to be measured? What are your KPIs? And do you have an aspirational goal of what that ecosystem will look like in perhaps 3 to 5 years' time?
Sri, I'd like to say we're just building on the existing momentum. The whole idea of the Startup Policy Forum is to have a platform that can have constructive, collaborative conversations with the government to take it to the next level. This is not to say that this partnership has not been working so far. As I said, there is hardly any government across the world that has given the kind of support to an entire ecosystem as this government has done. So I think we do have to acknowledge and appreciate that we have seen tremendous momentum, both on part of policymakers as well as the ecosystem, and taking India's startup ecosystem to the point it has. What next? I think we do see that, we're seeing this ecosystem now reaching a stage of maturity, where, as you mentioned earlier, there is a healthy pipeline of IPOs that is coming up. And for this trend to accelerate, we do require many more startups to flip back to India and re-domicile or move their headquarters back to India. And once again, I'd like to credit this government, because just with a little bit of our advocacy and push, we saw the government undertake a path-breaking policy change that actually allows companies to now use the fast-track mechanism to come back to India and carry out that merger process, which so far was done in a very cumbersome, time-consuming and onerous manner. But not what we're seeing right now is definitely that the government is supportive of this reverse flipping trend. We're seeing the government extending support. We think 80% of our hurdles have already been cleared. There are minor niggles, and we're working very proactively with the government, and the government being very supportive of that process.
And just if you can, if I can follow up, Shweta, can you just bring us up to speed with how much progress exactly has been made on regulatory reform to help Indian origin startups re-domicile from overseas? In other words, just how challenging has that experience to streamline the reverse flipping process been for you and policymakers?
Well, Sri, you have to understand that this is a new trend, right? And that's why it's only obvious that we're going to see some initial niggles around this process. I think what was important was the government having an appreciation of the fact that this is an important trend, and this will help India. It will help the startup ecosystem. It will help bring FDI back into India. It's going to help create jobs. And I think with that broader understanding, and that this is a real trend, because there are vast majority of companies that are domiciled either in Singapore or Delaware who were headquartered there, have now put their vote of confidence in the Indian capital markets in India and want to list in India, want to re-domicile back. But that requires an entire process to be carried out. And as I had said, the government has extended its support by bringing about a path-breaking policy change, which allows you to bypass a very cumbersome and time-consuming judicial process to allow that merger of the holding company into the Indian company, and now allows you to fast-track that, which means you're saving months and months of effort, and it allows companies to actually plan their listing process better, plan their entire re-domicile better. So I think we've seen that progress happen. And in many cases with our members, we're working with at least a dozen companies that have either undergone the reverse flip process and completed it, or are currently in the process. And I think the overall response has been hugely positive. As I said, there are minor niggles, and we are working through to iron out some of those niggles so that we can further accelerate that momentum.
Exactly. And we we had a graphic up there. We had Razorpay, we had Flipkart last week, Walmart-backed Flipkart, which announced that they are looking to shift, redomicile back to India. That being said, Shweta, taxation rules, there are FDI regulations to get through, national company law. It seems to be creating some seemingly endless procedural bottlenecks. How challenging are those getting around and overcoming those issues for the entire process?
Well, Sri, as I had said, that yes, there are procedures to be followed, and I think startups are cognizant of the fact that you have to follow the regulations in the right time, in the right spirit, and definitely we're seeing Indian startups working closely with the government, whether it is around foreign direct regulations or it is around other procedural delays. We have seen one of our members flip back in a record time of 3 months, 3 to 4 months. So that is huge progress compared to the kind of 12 to 18 months we were seeing earlier. So as I said, the process is working. The government is clearly supporting the process. And yes, because the trend is accelerating, because we have a state-based, I would say process framework where you have to go through the state regional directors and apply through them. There are times when you face procedural delays, but the government is fully committed, and we're seeing the government supporting us actively in ensuring that this process is further accelerated, because it is a win-win for everybody. It's a win-win for India, for these companies to come back, to come and list in the Indian capital markets. It's a big vote of confidence for India and for India's capital markets, and we're super excited about that trend and supporting our startups as well as policymakers.
How does FDI and the entire Make in India policy, the new tariff dynamic of manufacturing being deployed into India work into the ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, Shweta? Does it create an accelerator effect? I mean, last week was just extraordinary, wasn't it? We heard from Tesla, we heard from VinFast, Flipkart returning to India. Apple aims to source all US iPhones from India and a pivot away from China, according to a report in the Financial Times. How does that fit into the broader narrative? And as I said, does that create an accelerator effect for Indian startups?
Absolutely, not just for Indian startups, but for global companies looking and investing in India. We are clearly seeing what is playing out is India looking like a bright spot right now in the midst of the kind of geopolitical uncertainty and I would say confusion that we're seeing. But you know what? India has a very stable policy regime, very stable macroeconomic fundamentals, and that's making India look like a clear bright spot in the global economy. And I think this trend is going to benefit India immensely. You already heard about the kind of bilateral trade talks that India's Commerce Minister is carrying out right now with the UK. He spent 2 hours with our members last week, and the kind of palpable energy and excitement that continues to drive the momentum of India's overall investment space is fantastic. I can tell you just last evening I was with a large, I would say, European company that is looking at, coming into India and making big investments, making India a manufacturing base. So these are the kind of conversations we're hearing every single day, because in the midst, as we said, of the kind of global uncertainty, geopolitical realignments that we're seeing, India looks stable. India looks, good in terms of the growth rates, in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals, in terms of policy stability. And we think this is going to be a big trend that is going to continue through the year.
Interesting. Can we touch on, Shweta, on access to funding and fundraising, and also bring in the good, the bad and the ugly, if I may, in the Indian startup scene, which I've got to say has been blighted. Not all of them have been blighted by governance, compliance failures, or pure mismanagement, from Dunzo to Byju's, Snapdeal, Blue Smart. What are the lessons learned? And is this making investors, whether it's PE or VC, think twice?
Well, absolutely not. I think it's very important to understand, Sri, that when you see some of these, bad apples or these one-off cases, this is not a trend that is limited only to India or our ecosystem. We have seen this play out, and this is something that we have to understand are one-off cases. And we should not let those headlines determine what is happening overall in the ecosystem, which is healthy, which is, I think, doing very well and follows the highest governance standards. Yes, it's unfortunate to see some of these cases play out. And yes, I think there is room to address how we can ensure that we do not see more of these. But I think it's very important to move beyond those headlines and to say India's ecosystem will go through its business cycles, will go through its business pain. We're going to see funding cycles play out, but that is how all markets play out, right? There is going to be highs and lows. There are going to be periods of what we call the funding winter, moving into accelerated periods of investment activity, and that's part of a business cycle. What we've seen happen is unfortunate, but I think there is room to understand that these are one-off cases, and it's not fair to paint the entire ecosystem with that brush.
Understood. Shweta, on that note, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining me on Inside India. Shweta Rajpal-Kohli there from Startup Policy Forum. We will return in 2 minutes. Welcome back. US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick saying President Trump will reduce the impact of auto tariffs. Lin Lin joins us with more details. And if we talk about the impact over here in Asia, we must talk about what that means for the Japanese automakers, the Korean automakers, and the chances of whether this is going to be part of a trade deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're still waiting for the final details of what this sort of partial exemption on auto tariffs will be. But from what we understand, there's suggestion that there will be a removal of duties on foreign parts imported for domestically manufactured vehicles. So this could be seen as a net positive for Asian supply chains. So I'm thinking about the parts makers Aisin, Denso out of Japan, as well as Hyundai Mobis out of Korea, and also some of the Chinese suppliers as well. Now, we heard Howard Lutnick, he put out a statement saying that this is going to help in terms of giving companies looking to manufacture in the US a bit more runway, a bit more time to set up and so forth as well. As I said, we are waiting for the details of that. It's mixed, though, for the OEMs themselves, because keep in mind there is no talk here that the 25% duty on fully assembled cars going into the US would be removed. That is still sticking from all that we know. And then, of course, this week we are really focused on Minister Asakawa, his second round of talks with Besant and others that's set to take place place sort of in the back half of this week. And of course, from the Japanese side, given just how important the autos industry is, we heard the IMF downgrading the outlook for Japan 0.6 percentage points. So we're talking about potentially recessionary risks for the country as well. So this is going to be a crucial point here ahead. And then, of course, we have the Prime Minister Ishiba. He's during Japanese Golden Week on a tour of Southeast Asia, really trying to focus on diversification and reassurance of some of Japan's key regional trade partners as well.
Isn't everyone in this current environment? Lynn, thank you very much indeed for that. Right, let's turn our attention to JP Ong now, who has the highlights from Prime Minister Ishiba's trip to Vietnam. JP, good morning.
Good morning, Sri. And yes, he did wrap up a successful two-day visit to Vietnam, where he met with the four highest-ranking party officials in Vietnam, including General Secretary To Lam and Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh. During this meeting, they hit on two particular topics. One is predominantly economics and security and defense. On the economics front, they did talk about trade issues and both agreed to uphold multilateral trading systems and free trade principles as both countries grapple with impending tariffs from the Trump administration. They also decided to talk about $20 billion worth of possible investment projects, specifically in the areas of wind power, power transmission, and biomass conversion. But as we mentioned a while ago, one other aspect that made this visit interesting is that Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba also brought up the fact that they have to bolster defense cooperation. In fact, he also offered to include Vietnam as among the countries that could receive what is called the Official Security Assistance Program, which is where Japan provides free defense equipment to countries in Southeast Asia to help them upgrade their defense capabilities. Now, Vietnam said they will consider this and will take this under consideration and will exercise the option if necessary. This also could be one thing that Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba might bring up as he heads to the Philippines for his official visit and meets with Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as both countries try to build on deeper defense ties, and also perhaps talking about a possible joint drills between both countries' armed forces. And again, this is just to show that Japan is trying to deepen not only its economic reach across the region, but also perhaps their ability to provide defense support to countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. Sri, it's back to you.
Interesting. It's either defence energy or green energy that really defined this realignment. Thank you very much indeed for that, JP. Coming up on the programme, from factories to farms. India's economy is at a turning point. Industrial output is showing signs of recovery, and a normal monsoon could be the boost India needs. We'll discuss more after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Inside India. Some of the stories that we are keeping tabs on. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney and the ruling Liberals have won the elections, according to projections by local media. And CTV saying the Liberals will form a minority government. We are watching the Canadian dollar as this unfolds, and we will show you what the currency is doing. US dollar against the Canadian dollar at 138.63. So we are seeing some slight weakness in the loonie. India signing a $7.4 billion deal to buy 26 Rafale jets from France. The delivery of these fighter aircraft will be completed by the year 2030. And this comes as India tries to modernise its military to boost its forces deployed on the borders with China and Pakistan. And tensions between India and Pakistan are still simmering after a terrorist attack in Kashmir. Pakistan's defence minister now saying that the country has reinforced its forces as a military incursion by India is, in his words, imminent.
There is a likelihood that India will attempt an incursion in Pakistan and will engage Pakistan militarily. That is a possibility, a very clear and stark possibility. Cannot be ruled out.
Right, we are counting down to the market open in India, and I must say that the backdrop and the setup does look constructive for Indian equities, given the fact that Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary Bessent, has said that India is at the front of queue in terms of a trade deal with the United States. And also there's an element of belt and braces here going on with India also pursuing a trade agreement with the United Kingdom. We've got earnings to get through too. And in terms of the risks, the oil price remains relatively benign, so that's good news in terms of the inflationary picture, which we will talk about later on in the programme. Turning to the macro side of things, industrial output, however, missing estimates led by a slowdown in mining activity. March output growth came in at 3% on year. Reuters poll was expecting it to grow by 3.3%. Despite the miss, there was still a recovery from the 6-month lows hit in February. Manufacturing makes up over 77% of the industrial output index. Things could further improve this year for the country's economy thanks to a rosy monsoon forecast. Multiple weather agencies are expecting above average rainfall in the July to September period. 70% of the water needed to water India's crops and recharge its reservoirs comes from these seasonal rains. Let's talk about the macroeconomic outlook with Dharmakirti Joshi, Chief Economist at CRISIL. Dharmakirti, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Inside India. Net impact on tariffs, first of all, on India's economic outlook. How would you characterise it? And is 6.7% headline GDP at risk?
Well, when you look at the Indian economy, it's largely domestically driven. And so the kind of growth outcome we will get this year will depend on how the domestic levers offset the global headwinds, so to say. And as I think we are at 6.5% GDP growth right now, and we expect some downside to this. I think we are currently looking at revising our numbers. So I think there's a mild downside to that. But having said that, I think the positive factors for India are, one, I think inflation has come down, so the monetary policy will remain growth supportive, and we are factoring in 2 more rate cuts. I think the central bank has become decisively growth supportive. When they moved the stance from neutral to accommodative. And then I think government also gave some tax benefits to the middle class, which are going to play out from April onwards. And I think that's somewhat positive. And then I think on top of that, the investment thrust from the central government and the state government is likely to continue, particularly recognizing that the global factors are not very supportive. So I think there is some support that comes from the domestic economy. And I think India's cushions against the global turmoil are also pretty decent at this juncture. Our current account deficit is quite low, and we expect it at 1.3% of GDP in the fiscal year 25-26, which is the current fiscal year. The forex reserves are ample, and they have been rebuilt, I think, recently. So I think that offers you some cushion against the turbulence. And then I think also to remember, since you mentioned tariffs, I think India's structure of trade is such that I think when you look at exports, nearly 50% of the exports are in services, and services exports are less impacted than the goods export. And what we found while looking at the correlations between global trade cycle and Indian trade cycle, we found that while the goods trade cycle is quite synchronized with the global trade cycle, the services has its own momentum. Yes. And even the WTO recently said that the services trade is still likely to grow at 4% globally, whereas the goods trade is likely to shrink. So I think that also offers some buffer to the economy, apart from very healthy balance sheets of the corporates that we enjoy right now.
Dharma, so there's a lot of issues you raised there, and I just wanted to circle back to the tariffs and hopefully what could be an offset. How closely are you watching the US-India trade talks? And if a bilateral trade agreement is concluded by around autumn, then what could that mean for India's export sectors and the larger economy?
The first thing it would mean is the end of uncertainty. So right now, I think all the investment decisions and major decisions are on hold because you want to know what kind of tariff regime you're likely to face. So, and I think, and that's going to be positive for the private corporate investment cycle in India as well. So that's one part. And then I think the anxiety in the export dependent sectors, I think will reduce once you know, I think what the tariff, eventual tariff agreement is. It's very difficult for me to speculate what it's going to be, but I think the clarity on tariffs itself, I think will allow you to plan better and also I think and reduce anxiety, I think, which many of the exporters are currently facing.
It was a remarkable week last week, wasn't it, Dharma, in terms of Tesla, VinFast, and then rounded off by this report in the FT, Apple aiming to source all US iPhones from India in a pivot away from China. If all of that materializes, then are we looking at India emerging as a haven even from these tariff woes and uncertainty? And are we looking at an FDI boom and an FDI wave into India?
Well, I think what you just mentioned suggests that I think there is now India is likely to align more with the global supply chains if these materialize, because India did not benefit much from the China +1 because investments went to Vietnam, to Mexico, and other Asian economies. So this time, I think there is hope that, particularly, I think I'm hopeful of electronics, where I think we will have some manufacturing capability also gradually develop. Right now, we are in the assembly phase. And then also, I think in the solar sector, I think where I think India is trying to move towards gradual back-end production of some of the components, etc. So I think, yes, I think this would mean more alignment with the global supply chain. And if this plays out well, then you have more FDI also coming. Having said that, I think we need to continue to keep improving our logistics, I think, which are very essential for becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. Mm-hmm. And I think government post the pandemic has focused on creating infrastructure. I think all those measures need to be continuously be supported from the government. And I think here I also want to point out that India also has its own version of industrial policy, which is giving incentive to the upcoming sectors which would not grow on their own. So there are incentives for electronics, there are incentives for solar, and there are several other sectors. There are 14 sectors where government is giving incentives for a limited period of time. So all that put together means that we are gradually moving towards strengthening of the manufacturing sector in India. And I think India's manufacturing hasn't done too well in the last couple of years because the share of manufacturing in GDP has stagnated, so to say. So this is an opportunity for India to latch on to the global supply chain shifts that are likely to take place.
Dharma, how would you characterize the trade relationship between India and China in an environment where India really needs to look at all of its options and look at all of its alliances in this period of uncertainty and turbulence? And having said all of that, India and China remain erstwhile strategic adversaries. How is India squaring that circle?
Well, I think that the trade relations will continue. I think it has only grown over the years, and I think India has dependence on Chinese components. I think even for the pharmaceutical sector, which is a major export-oriented sector, the essential ingredients come from China. So I think the trade relations are going to continue, but they might reshape, I think, a bit going ahead. India also runs a huge trade deficit with China. I think it hardly exports much to China, but it imports a lot of stuff that it critically needs at this juncture. And India is gradually trying to move towards self-dependency on some of them. That's going to take time. So till the time that happens, I think we will continue to engage very actively with China as far as the trade is concerned.
We were speaking earlier to Shweta Rajpal-Kauri at the Startup Policy Forum about the need to really be more ambitious in scaling India's startup ecosystem towards advanced manufacturing. To Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal's point, we need to create quality IT jobs beyond delivery boys and delivery girls. Is there an inflection point there, Dharma, that we need to be at? Are we not there yet? Are we making progress towards advanced manufacturing and India perhaps becoming a super chip powerhouse or a deep tech powerhouse? How far are we away from that inflection point?
Definitely, the movement is positive, but I think we are some distance from there. I think even for our IT, ITS, exports, etc., we've been moving up the chain. I mean, I think there are global capability centers where I think a lot of foreign companies are setting up units in India to do R&D and many other things. So gradually, I think you're moving up the chain as far as I think the service exports are also concerned. And within the domestic economy, I think it's going to take time. As I said, I think it's going to be a gradual process. And you need a very good physical infrastructure for success of all these things. And India is gradually moving towards that. I think we are not there as yet. I think you have to be very competitive in your power prices, in your logistics, which I think the direction is positive, but I think it's hard for me to say when exactly we'll be at the inflection point or when we'll achieve that.
And this was an issue and a challenge that came out during the election, Dharma. You and I know this. At what point will younger generation of job seekers be able to find jobs and secure jobs that are quality jobs as programmers, coders, and move up the value chain as well, as opposed to just working in the services sector as delivery boys and girls, as the minister has said? At what point are we going to see that?
I think India has quite a massive workforce. And I think you need to move in all directions. I mean, so you need to take advantage of the improvements that are taking place or advancements that are taking place in technology. I think we've done very well with respect to adoption of digital technology, and I think that has spillover effects on jobs as well. But I think when you look at the overall workforce in India, I look at it as I think you need people skilled for the high-end jobs, but there's a lot of jobs in India which require your vocational training, so to say. I think for instance, there's always a shortage of plumbers, electricians, healthcare workers, and these are also being demanded from across the world. I mean, now I think India is not only exporting its workforce to the Middle East, but I think even to the developed countries as they age faster. So I think there is an opportunity to create more respectability towards factory jobs, towards vocationally trained stuff. And I think this is going to service the Indian requirements, where always we see a skill mismatch in India, and also the requirements abroad. So that's one way to look at it. The other is, I think you need to continuously keep upscaling your education system, and skilling, I think, is very critical, because as the nature of jobs change, I think you need to skill at a much faster pace. I think gone are the days then where you could have done your degree and then that would have served you throughout your life. I think you need to keep upgrading yourself. And I think there is attention being paid to these things in the budget. And then finally, I think how the artificial intelligence, which is gradually beginning to influence our lives, I think how does that get adopted in the corporate sector, in general in the economy? I mean, is it labor displacing or is it labor augmenting? I think these are some of the questions we need to continuously keep asking. And also, I think, keep preparing the population for plug into these new opportunities.
Yes. Dharma, I just wanted to bring in the currency quickly at this point. The rupee has risen above 84.95.75 per US dollar to hit a year-to-date peak. Is a level like that a problem from an export competitiveness point of view in an environment where export growth is already relatively subdued? And where are you putting external demand moving forward for India?
So I think your exports depend on two things. I mean, one is what is the growth in your export destination? That's the dominant factor. The less dominant factor is the currency. And I think you need to look at over the cycle, I mean, how the currency behaves. I think rupee has been, over the cycle, continuously depreciating against the greenback. So I would say that I think there will be ups and downs which will happen. But I think the trend is of rupee depreciating against the dollar. And I think maybe at times it depreciates faster, at times it appreciates. So I would look at over the cycle rather than just looking at the movements from day to day or month to month, so to say.
Understood. In terms of broader global economic factors, do you feel that a recession originating in the United States is a non-negligible risk in this environment? And if that did materialize, Dharma, what would be the transmission mechanism and the spillover impact onto India? Would it be through IT services, enterprise spending slowing down perhaps dramatically? And we are already hearing some warning signals from the IT services companies on that front.
But yeah, I think, first of all, I think recession is not, in US is not the base case for us. I think the IMF also was talking about pretty decent rate of growth. And I think S&P also has a reasonably slower growth outlook than last year. But I think I would say not in the recession, definitely not in the recession zone. But yeah, even I think slowing down or sharply slowing down growth in US does impact, I think, India, because one, the discretionary spending there will slow down if the growth slows down faster. And US is India's biggest trading partner. Actually, India's exposure to US and Europe over the last 7-8 years has only increased. We used to export about 31% of our exports used to go to these two regions. Now it is 36% just within 5-6 years. So I think our exposure has increased. So if there is a slowdown there, it does mean even more slower exports, I think. So there is a connection there. And then I think rest is a bit speculative right now as to how I think the Fed will behave and how I think other things will play out. But yes, I think it's not good news, certainly, for a country which has got more integrated with the advanced countries.
Understood. Dharma, getting back to the domestic inflationary outlook, looks relatively benign because international oil prices are still trading around the 60s, and we've got a favourable monsoon season. But can you have too much of a good thing? And the extreme weather that climate change has been creating and the risk of too much rain and flooding, could that be inflationary? Whereby it destroys food crops and raises food price inflation. And to what degree does that complicate the RBI's methodology and outlook?
The point is, over the last couple of years, the climate-related risks have risen, and we all know that agriculture output doesn't depend on the quantum of rainfall. It also depends on its distribution over time and over geographies. So what we have seen is that over the last few years, because of the climatic shifts, the pattern of monsoons itself has changed, I think, leading to excess rains and in more instances of excess rains and dry patches, so to say. So what happens to we know about the quantum of rain. I think that's very first set of positive news on the economy, but we don't know much about its distribution and how the heat waves, etc., will play out. So I think we have, last year, for instance, I think there was a heat wave, but the agriculture output didn't get impacted. So it depends on at what period. I mean, is the heat wave striking at the time when the crop is to be harvested? Then I think it impinges more. So there are, so you have to keep your fingers crossed, I think, on the climate part. But so far, I think we have positive news on the rainfall side. And we are working with the assumption that agriculture will do well, food inflation will be under control. Remember that agriculture is 18% of India's GDP, so it matters for growth. It has more than 40% weight in consumer price index, so it matters for inflation. And I think the central bank doesn't look at core inflation, it looks at the aggregate inflation. And we've seen that food inflation did actually delay central bank's rate cuts, which could have happened earlier, because it was so high that it kept the overall inflation much above the central bank target of 4%. So I think food inflation matters a lot, and so do monsoons.
Dharma, great conversation, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Dharmakirti Joshi there from CRISIL. Right, the markets are open in Mumbai. Let's take a look at some of the early movers after this short break. We are back in 2 minutes. Right, the Indian markets have been up and running for about 10 minutes, and the setup is looking quite constructive. As you can see here, the Nifty 50, the benchmark up by about 0.5%, and it really seems to be down to the trade deals. Scott Bessent, US Treasury Secretary, has made it very clear that India is, in all likelihood, at the front of the queue in terms of a trade deal with the United States. So that may mean tariffs are called off. And then at the same time, we have India negotiating a potential trade deal with the United Kingdom. Let's give you a sense of the rupee, which is looking firmer against the US dollar and has been hitting new year-to-date highs of over 85. Dollar Indian rupee at 85.0870. Shares of Adani Green Energy are in focus of the Indian renewable energy company's independent review of US charges against it found no non-compliance or irregularities. Remember, founder Gautam Adani and top executives were accused of paying $265 million in bribes to get power supply contracts in India and of misleading US investors during fundraising. The stock up by 0.7%, and it comes as Adani Green Energy reported a 53% rise in quarterly net profit. Adani Total Gas, let's take a look at that, posted a drop in profit as a fall in the government's allocated supply led to higher gas purchase costs. The stock, however, up by 0.7%. Right, that's it for today's show. Tomorrow we have a look at India's real estate sector. The CEO of Embassy REIT, Ritvik Bhattacharjee, will join us. We will also venture into the budding sports and gaming sector in India with Centre Court Capital. That's it for today's programme on Inside India. I hope you enjoyed it. Keep watching CNBC. Dan Murphy and Access Middle East is coming up next. Have a good day.